structures of teams, and also understanding the different processes and the mechanisms that go into generating team effectiveness. So we're going to be discussing, to start with, some characteristics of teams and how teams form. But then we're going to shift to one main model, and on the basis of that model, we're going to be going through the rest of the chapter. And that model is concerned with helping us understand what generates team effectiveness, or how could we accomplish team effectiveness. Okay, so understanding all these factors that lead to it, that's how I would recommend you study for this chapter. Is you start with that model as your blueprint, and then you go off. Okay. So some key definitions and characteristics. Teams, when we think of them, particularly in the organizational behavior context, or in corporations, or just in the organizational context, to be more fair to it, they're generally consistent of two or more people. One key feature of those two or more people, so this group of individuals that are working together, one thing that characterizes them is this idea of interdependence, right? In that they are dependent on each other to derive outcomes. So success of the team, or delivering outcomes, or delivering work, could be really stifled based on somebody else, right? So we're all contingent on one another. We're all riding on one another to actually deliver this main goal, to finalize something, or to accomplish this mission of the team or the organization. Okay? So some characteristics to recap those. So two people or more, obviously. Interdependence, that is a key feature here that we're going to be seeing it come up again and again today throughout our lectures as it shapes the context within which we're operating, right? So it's the fact that my efforts are reliant on somebody else's effort, okay? Our final deliverable is reliant on us collaborating, perhaps, okay? So that's what you need to think of when you're thinking of interdependence, okay? And those group of individuals, they're working towards something. They share a common purpose. They share a common goal, right? So we've already seen that in the definition of organizations, and we're seeing it again here in terms of teams. That there's a certain common purpose or a common goal that they're working towards, and they influence each other in going about that. Okay. One thing that we're going to be seeing also later on in our lecture, this aspect of identity, right? So if the people forming this team technically, right? If people are put in a team, but they don't feel that they identify with this team, or they don't perceive themselves to be members of this team, that is also something that is important and we need to pay attention to, right? You want to feel that membership. You want to feel like you belong and you identify with that group, or with that entity, with that collective entity. Okay, so that is another characteristic, I would say, of teams, is that perception that you belong to something bigger. Okay. Now, teams in general, there's different ways of categorizing them, and you've probably heard of different names or similar concepts, like a task force, for example, right? So that is kind of a variation of teams. And the reason why we have those different variations is because teams are usually categorized, or the typology is kind of derived on the basis of. So one key criterion is permanence, right? So are you getting together and doing a project that is very short term? Is it a 3-day project, right? That might be a task force, for example, right? So it's nothing permanent. You're not working with these people forever and ever. You're just gathering to work on this one little piece of work, and then you're dismantling, and that's it, right? So permanence, that time length, okay? That's one key criterion. Another key criterion is skill differentiation. So how much variety of skills are we seeing in the team? Okay? Are they specialized skills? Are some people occupying support roles or administrative roles, and other people are occupying strategic roles, right? So teams, their variation or their type could also differ on that basis. And that, what skills are we seeing represented? What type of backgrounds are we seeing represented in this team? And the last criterion is the differentiation in terms of kind of authority or leadership, right? So one distinction that we see between hierarchical organizations versus non-hierarchical organizations, or like startups versus bureaucratic organizations that have existed for ages and ages, right, is in the level of power and influence and authority given to workers, right? So we have this trend called holacracy, and that's what you might see at places like high-tech companies, startups, where they all share the leadership. There's no hierarchy, there are no fixed roles, everybody just joins like a tribe, they call them tribes, and they just pitch in everything they know, right? And that leadership rotates based on the needs of the project, okay? So that's a situation where we're seeing kind of leadership or authority or power is not housed at the top. It's diffused. It's all over, right? So that is kind of another criterion that we need to consider.
Sorry, what is
This phenomenon or this trend is called holacracy.
Holacracy, like
Holocracy. Yeah. So that's that last criterion that we need to give consideration to is who's making the decisions. Is it diffused across the board? Is it shared? Or is it housed at the top? Is one person doing it and then just communicating it downwards? Okay, so that's another thing we consider. One distinction that we need to make or kind of just mention is the difference between kind of formal teams or teams that are designated or sanctioned by the organization and informal groups, okay? Or those groups that come to be kind of in a very unofficial manner, right? It's usually driven by employees themselves, perhaps, and those groups come to be on the basis of shared interests or shared, unofficial types of things that bring those people together, right? So that is something like a walking club at work, right? It's not something that's really designated by the organization. It's not sanctioned by the organization. It probably doesn't receive funding from the organization. It's just something that brings employees together, right? It helps with bonding. It helps them kind of support one another. It helps them, vent about their day to each other, right? But just like it could be something helpful and something that's good for bonding, those are of key concern. Informal groups and organization could be really detrimental. Because given the fact that they're not sanctioned or acknowledged by the organization, we don't know that they exist, right? So sometimes managers or leadership in the organization doesn't know that those informal groups exist. And what if those informal groups, because it comes to be on the basis of commonality or shared interest, what if that shared interest is we want to get together to gossip about Debbie, right? So that's kind of something that's negative. That's something that could be even considered abusive. But you have no authority, or you may not even know it as a manager that this is going on or this is existent, right? And that's where it becomes of concern to us, in that it is something that is causing a negative effect in the environment, in the cohesion of the group perhaps, because we're all bonding against one person, right? The environment is cliquey now, okay? But management and leadership doesn't know about that group. It's informal. So it could actually be quite lethal, okay? So we have to consider both sides. They could be very positive for support, for venting for employees, for helping build cohesion and a sense of common identity, but they could also go the completely other way. They could actually be detrimental to functioning in the organization. In terms of the advantages and disadvantages of teams and why we rely on teamwork in organizations, thoughts on why teams are great? They're up there, but from your personal experience, give me some main points. Okay, so you mean like you're engaging everybody in something, right? Everybody gets a say. Okay, so we're bringing everyone in. We're increasing involvement. We're increasing engagement. Okay, so those are like our HR, OB type buzzwords for that. There's stuff for why teams are great and why we rely on them and push more for them. Yes?
increased knowledge.
Absolutely, right? So you're diversifying perspectives, you're bringing in more information, and you're exchanging that between people. So knowledge transfer is facilitated, right? But also not just kind of, the same knowledge is transferred, but more so you're bringing a richer perspective. Everybody brings in their own edge to something, to their own say on the problem. Okay? Other things, other benefits?
Increasing your output.
Yeah, so we usually say, better way to coin it is the quality of the outcomes, right? It's usually better, right? And that's because more people are involved in vetting this decision or vetting this outcome, that you have a greater chance of poking holes at it and figuring out where the weaknesses in it are. So at the very end, after everybody kind of took a stab at this, it's better. It generates a better outcome. So the quality is better, okay? Now let's be all negative about it. Why are teams horrible to deal with? Why could they potentially stand in the way?
Contrasting opinions.
Okay, so yeah, again, and it is all about balance. So sometimes the team may be very diverse, very different to the extent where it gets in the way and there's no reconciling that, right?
I also think there's different people from different teams, so sometimes different personalities clash.
Sure, so we have the personality element to it, we have the different kind of backgrounds and perspectives, so all sorts of differences could, if there's too much difference that's not being reconciled, it could be detrimental. Okay, other thoughts on why teams are bad? Sorry.
It takes a long time to do stuff.
Absolutely, right? Let's say I want to make something tomorrow. I want to decide on something by the end of the day, right? Do I have time to assemble a team and get them used to each other, right? So we want to consider that. And that's something that would fall under process losses. So when we say process losses occur in teamwork, right? That's kind of all that overhead or all that administration or kind of maintaining the team, maintaining the peace in the team. Those are all things that go under process losses, right? So by the time we send out a meeting invite, by the time we all find a time that works for everyone, by the time we all kind of do introductions, by the time we actually get comfortable working with each other, this is all taking away, right? Versus one person doing the project, right? This is all taking away from our time, right? Something relevant to that. And what they're calling Brooks' Law, essentially in layman's terms, it's kind of like too many cooks burn the pot, right? So the more people you add to a team, sometimes that starts hindering your progress, right? Because everybody has an opinion, everybody has something to say, everybody wants to be smart, everybody wants to show everyone that they're smart and they know everything, okay? So that goes on as well. And lastly, one thing that we see in group projects in school, for example, social loafing, right? We take advantage of each other. We think that the other person in the group is going to do all the work, so I may as well slack and not put in my own effort into it, right? So we see social loafing quite a bit. I'm seeing some heads shaking, right? It's like, let's be passive aggressive right now. It's our revenge, finally. So that is something that concerns us in teams, but we do have remedies for it, okay? And we'll talk about that in terms of structure. Also, another thing that we consider, or another aspect of team outcomes, so in general, kind of this slide is pertaining to teams in general. Why are they good versus why are they bad? But one specific element of teams and the work that they do that really concerns us is when teams are getting together to make decisions and truly understanding how they are impacted by that team structure. So making a decision by yourself as an individual versus making a decision as a team, right? It's a very different dynamic. And when you're making a decision as a team, there are various things that go on there, okay? So we've already mentioned some of them. So we have time constraints, right? So it's lengthier. It takes longer when you're doing a decision, when you're making a decision as a team. And you may not always have that viability. An organization may not always have that much time on its hands to actually gather a team to make a decision, okay? We need to consider that. Something else that goes on in teams when they're discussing something and coming to a conclusion on something is that evaluation apprehension. And essentially it's saying kind of like sometimes we stifle ourselves. We are shy to kind of voice our opinions because we fear that, we're going to get laughed at or somebody's going to downplay our idea or our thoughts, right? So you may find yourself stifling your opinions, not voicing them. You're not as vocal. And another thing that is similar to that is that when we're working in teams, we all have that tendency to conform, even in society, right? Because we are very tribal and we like to kind of not stand out. We have that need or that knack for conforming. We always tend to justify whatever is common, whatever is prevalent, right? So we have that peer pressure always implicitly there. It's always lingering in the environment, always kind of pushing us to agree with everyone, okay? Especially if you have somebody who has a very dominant personality in the team, and they're just kind of like coercing everyone else to agree with them, and everybody else maybe has a weaker personality or they're very agreeable, and they're just going to say, yeah, sure, because they don't want to cause conflict, right? So we see that go on there. Another thing that gets in the way of good decision making is kind of when the team is quite overconfident. So let's say a team has historically been stellar, they've been great performers. They may kind of like take that confidence to a whole new level, and that may end up hurting them in the end, right? They overestimate how self-efficacious they are. They think that they're the best and nobody could really bring them down. But that is something that could be of concern to us. One last thing, or another thing as we wrap this up, is that aspect of information sharing, right? If you're working with multiple people, sometimes we end up kind of forming little groups within that group. And you may share certain pieces of information with the person sitting next to you, but you may not share it with the person across the table from you. And then that creates a divide in what everybody knows in the team. So information sharing doesn't always go as perfectly as we would hope it would. Okay? So we need to consider that in teams. some things that could help us when it comes to decision making in teams, some things that could refine the process or make it go more smoothly. We want to set out the rules, the norms, the traditions, the restrictions, the consequences as early as possible, right? As a team, we're going to say this is what works for us as a collective, and this is what we're going to abide by, right? So we have team contracts, we have things like that. We may have like an initial kickoff meeting where we discuss all these norms, right? So something along those lines. The more diverse your team is, up to a certain extent, right? You always want some element of diversity. And when we say diversity, by the way, don't always think of it in a superficial manner in that it's just like based on ethnic background or man versus woman. It's diversity of thought, it's diversity of experience, diversity of background, diversity of perspective. It's just diversity across the board, right? It could be in terms of personality, right? If your personalities are very vastly different, that is a significant form of diversity. Okay? No.
So when you're a manager and you're going to make a team, you really have to know everything about your employees.
Yeah, and that's why we kind of like try to do the vetting a bit early on when at the recruitment stage, right? So we always try to understand what works for us as an organization as a whole, right? But we don't like when you go in for an interview, you don't only interview with HR. HR is your like general department for the whole organization, but you also interview with the team manager, right? So they're vetting you for both environments, right? So they're trying to get a sense of how you would fit in, right? Managers have to kind of craft that balance. How do they strike that optimal level of diversity? Because too much diversity could be detrimental, and too little diversity is also definitely detrimental, right? So how do you strike that optimal balance? That is where the manager really has to be very attuned into what is represented in their team. Checks and balances, we already mentioned that in the sense of you always want to have consequences, rewards laid out, right? Or like, we will be checking on your progress throughout. So you always want to have that, make sure that that level of accountability or that element of accountability is there, okay? Team size is one thing that we want to consider. You want to make sure, again, you're hitting that optimal team size. So similar to diversity, you want to hit the right optimal size of team, okay? Now, in terms of the different steps that teams go through to actually develop, or what makes, the different steps that they go through to become a team, there are generally 5 phases that we focus on. And those are the phases of forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Okay? In the forming stage, that's when you're initially meeting everyone. Okay, so that's you, as a manager, I've put these 5 people together, and I'm telling them you are tasked with delivering this outcome. Okay, the forming stage, that's when they're doing introductions. That's when they're kind of like perceiving each other, kind of subliminally vetting each other out, seeing what they're all about, understanding the differences in their backgrounds. Okay, so it's like lots of meet and greets are going on, lots of assessing everyone implicitly. Okay, so we have that going on in that forming stage or phase. And then storming, that's when, you might have started, dabbling with the project. You started discussing the outcome that you're working towards. You started kind of getting into the details of the work that's to be done. Okay? Now remember, that's a group of people that's never worked with each other before. So that's where the diversity of these people is starting to kick in. So everyone is going to have differences of opinion. Everyone is going to have a different perspective. Everyone has a different perception of what the project is all about. So the reason why this stage is called storming is because initially when groups get together, there's always some level of conflict at the start. Okay? They don't see eye to eye yet. Okay? They're a brand new group of people. They've never worked with each other before. So they're still getting used to each other. Okay? So that's why conflict arises in that storming stage. But then rationality kicks in and they're like, well, we can't just shoot the shit the whole time and completely let this project kind of like derail and never get anything done. We gotta actually bond and figure this stuff out. So that's where we kick into the norming stage. And from the name of it, norming, right? Emphasis on norm. So here they're getting together and they're saying, okay, we disagreed enough, we had enough conflict. Now it's time to figure out what works for us as a group. How will we work best together? What norms, what routines, what traditions, what consequences and rules, checks and balances, what forms of communication work for us as a collective? We're going to embed that in our team, and that will help us move forward, right? So that norming stage is all about figuring out the rules, the norms, the things that work for us as a team. Okay? What really gets us working in high gear. And that's when we're able to kind of shift all the way to that performing stage. That's when we've kind of like overcome our differences. We're no longer being petty about differences between us. We're really focused on the task. We're quite task-oriented now. So that's why it's called performing. We're actually getting down to it. We're really working on delivering the outcome. And finally, you have that adjourning stage, and that's where, if the project succeeds, then great. This was a great team effort. If the project fails, you might want to kind of reconvene, say, what went wrong? How could we fix this for next time? Okay, so that's something that can go on in the adjourning stage.
I don't know if this is a weird question, but during the storming stage, what are some strategies to, because everyone has, preconceived notions of other people, whether you know them, but what are some strategies to, go in with as much open mind as possible and without, immediately coming to conclusions?
Yeah, I mean, there are various things that come to mind. Like I would say one thing is, as a manager who's putting that team together, do you want to consider kind of you taking the lead and facilitating that first kind of meeting or kickoff? Perhaps that might help if there's some figure of authority kind of adding some structure to it. That could help speed us through the storming stage. But also sometimes I would say, do you necessarily want to avoid it? Because you kind of want that difference to also kind of shift. You don't want homogeneity to kick in right off the bat. You don't want people, like I think we talked about this in the personality chapter, but do we always want agreeable people? Should we always be advocating agreeableness? So that's something that I would say we want to consider there is, okay, we don't want complete storming. We don't want this to completely derail, but we want some level of conflict, right? We want constructive conflict, right? So I would say you want to let people vent. You want to let people voice their differences of opinion and their perspectives on others.
Without being aggressive.
Yeah, for sure, right? There are limits, and that's why I'm saying, if you feel that it's a team that's kind of very volatile, you might want an authority figure there to kind of diffuse that a bit. So there's various perspectives on it. It is very situation dependent, I would say, right? Depending on the people that are present. Do you go ahead?
Yes, during this last one.
Adjourning?
Yeah, adjourning. Would this happen just basically a post-mortem for a project, or because if the team worked just it's just a review after a project?
It's kind of when the decision, when maybe you've gotten feedback on the project, right? So we delivered the project and our boss said, "Great work." That's it. We're done, right? That's where you celebrate your success as a team and you say, "Well, wow, this worked for us," and I'm going to do that more so in other teams.
Okay.
Right? So yeah, it's usually kind of after the thing has been submitted and we receive feedback.
Cool. Yeah.
What do you mean by that arrow is coming back from performing to the forming and from performing to the norming? See that arrow?
Okay, yeah. So here, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that, it doesn't always go in one line. Sometimes you hit glitches along the way. So sometimes you may have stormed and then figured out some things that worked for you, but different changes in the environment kind of let's say we were working on this project and we were under the assumption that we have a $1 million budget and we figured out the routines and traditions in accordance with these criteria and contingencies. All of a sudden, financial crisis, we no longer have this much budget. So there's all sorts of changes. So you can't just expect to still be going statically or as if everything is still going under the same assumptions. Things change in the environment. So sometimes you might need to kind of go back and reconfigure things. So that's why we're seeing this kind of going back and forth, is because we need to always consider the situation and the contingencies. The situation is not always stable. So we always need to keep in mind, sometimes we do need to go back, reassess things. Sometimes, we've gotten along for a while, but then something happened. We hit a certain glitch. We hit a certain wall. We might need to go back and do some more bonding or figure out some better norms for us. Okay? So keep that in mind. It's not always static. Things change, and we need to be very receptive to it. Good, Mo?
Yes, thank you.
Are we looking at this being in that specific order?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it goes, forming, storming. Generally, that's under very idealistic assumptions. And that's why we always need to make sure that, we're not too irrational if we need that it's all perfect. Okay? There's an element of kind of irrationality in assuming that this is all perfect. Because does step out.
Going through each of the steps, like, is it like an effective group won't happen if you skip a step? That's what bottom line is.
Now, not necessarily, but one thing that I will say is, if you're a group that's worked with each other before, you could bypass the forming stage and the storming stage. Like, let's say you're a group who's worked with each other on several projects in the past. You've already done those introductions and that bonding at first, right? And you may have already figured out your differences and resolved those. You may already have norms established, right, implicitly, right? So you may automatically jump to that, okay? So, yeah, you don't always have to go through them in that order necessarily. But again, this is very idealistic, simplistic terms of, yes, generally teams go through those phases. But you could bypass them sometimes. Okay? Other things that we need to consider when it comes to kind of the development of teams, and that is something that we touched on a bit earlier, is that element of identity. And we shouldn't discount that. Like teamwork, you know, it could be very mechanical and there's so many structures to it and so many kind of technical characteristics, but also the element of identity and understanding what represents us as a collective versus just me as an individual, right? Why am I in this team? Why are we doing this as a collective? Developing that identity of a team, that is something that we need to consider. And another thing that helps in that development of a team is what we call kind of mental models. And essentially here what we're saying, like a layman, like just kind of a more simple way of understanding this, is we develop these blueprints for how we work as a team, okay? Like a mental model is kind of a blueprint. So after a while, we start kind of, you know, assuming that, okay, this is what works for us, this is what's always worked for us, so we're going to kind of always be doing that. This person usually does this person usually does this. We usually communicate on a daily basis, and then we have a whole team meeting on Friday. So it's all these routines, all these traditions, right? Those are kind of like blueprints, or what we call mental models, right? We kick into this gear right away when we're working in a team, because that's what we've established as a norm or as traditions that work for us, okay? So those help with our development, right? In terms of building that identity and that level of cohesion.
Can it be ever toxic to just assume like that from the people that you've worked with?
Yeah, because let's say you've worked with each other in a group before, and that's what worked with you then, but the environment has changed, right? So that's why we say, you know, always account for innovation, always account for change, because if you're so fixed in one mental model or in one blueprint, okay, the environment may not be calling for that anymore. You might need to be receptive to that, right? But there's always some general level of kind of like that mental model or that blueprint in terms of what works for us, right? So as an organization, like again, kind of could be very simple as like, you know, we have Friday meetings where we all get together and we recap what happened in the week, right? So, you know, whether there's a financial crisis or not, this is something that's beneficial in a way. So that's what we're more so tapping into, the mental models here. Okay? And now getting to that model of team effectiveness. Okay, so as I mentioned, one thing that we're concerned with here is how do we get to this final outcome of effectiveness? How do we make sure that a team is truly delivering a good outcome? How do we make sure that they're actually accomplishing something great? Okay, and that's why we've allocated a lot of attention and a lot of effort, research effort, to understand what are the things that come together that generate a good dynamic for leading to team effectiveness. And organizational behavior research has pinpointed or has focused on 3 key criteria. Okay? And those are the elements of team design, and those are kind of more structural things like size, the composition in terms of like diversity, let's say, or the skills, the diversity of skills in your team. Okay? We have team states, and that's kind of like, you know, just like we as individuals or as human beings, we have emotional states. A team, as a collective of individuals, also has a certain state, also has kind of emotions that it undergoes. Okay, and that's something that we give attention to. And lastly, we have that aspect of team processes, right? And that's essentially the mechanisms, the different activities that go on, right? So we have other constructs that really tap into this element. And today we're going to be going through the last remaining slides of this lecture, understanding those different aspects. Okay? Because when they come together, they generate team effectiveness. Okay? That's how we're concerned with this model. Okay? Now, one thing that we need to understand that falls under team. Sorry,
Yeah, what's the
each other, right? So they're always in communication with each other. It's not always kind of static, right? It's always, things are going this way now, but, we hit a glitch, we need to go back and assess that, right? So it's very interactive, it's very, yeah. So the first element that we're focusing on is the team design element, and we're concerned with task characteristics, okay? So one thing, essentially what we're concerned with here is, some projects or some pieces of work don't really require team effort, okay? So what we're assessing here is, what are those tasks? What task types are the best? What types of tasks are really a good fit for teams, okay? Because sometimes some types of tasks are really more individual types of tasks. Like one person could, power through it in an hour. Do you really want to go through the effort of assembling a team and taking time and effort from everyone and wasting everyone's time for a project that could have been done by one person? So that's what we're interested in here, is what types of tasks are the best tasks for teamwork or for team effort? Generally, tasks that are higher in complexity, okay? And as you might assume, that's because we need more perspectives, we need more human capital, we need more manpower, right? So building a house, that's a complex task. We need lots of people with lots of specializations for it, okay? So complexity is one criterion or one aspect or a type of task. A complex task is a suitable task for teams to work on. Another type of, or another characteristic of tasks that makes it suitable for teamwork is a task that has some level of structure. It is well structured in that I could divide the work, okay? It's not a task that is very ambiguous that, you can't say, okay, person A is in charge of doing this, person B is in charge of doing this, person C is in charge of doing this, okay? It's a task that has that structure. That makes it easier or more suitable for it to be a team effort, okay? So you want that level of structure within a task, okay? Because it makes things easier to coordinate. And lastly, we have the element of interdependence, okay? So the more interdependence there is between different people or members of a team, okay? Or the more this task, so for example, think of an assembly line, right? An assembly line features a high level of interdependence. So you can't have one person like doing this first piece of producing a widget, and then they're going to say, and now I'm done being person A. I, myself, I'm going to move to the second position and do task number B, or the task B, okay? So you need different people because this task is very interdependent by virtue of its structure, okay? You need different people collaborating, okay? So interdependence is something that we need to consider, okay? The more interdependent the task is, the more, the better fit a team environment is for. In terms of interdependence, the types of dependence that we see amongst people, kind of going from low to high, you may see people depending on one shared resource, okay? So that could be some form of interdependence. You may see people kind of, and this is kind of the example of an assembly line. It's sequential in that I cannot do my piece of the process until person A does their piece of the process. And then once I do my piece of the process, person C can do their piece of the process. Okay? So really there's only dependence between C and B directly, and there's an informal dependence between A and C. Okay? And then you have that very high level of interdependence, and that is when all members are dependent on each other. Okay? Like it's not sequential, it is just all the time we are always dependent on each other. Okay? And that's where we see that reciprocal level of dependence. Another thing in terms of team design that we are concerned with is team size. Okay? Generally, a rule is the smaller the team, the better. Okay? You don't want kind of a team that's completely understaffed. We're not saying we want an understaffed project, a team project or a task force. Okay? But the more people you add, the more administration there is, the more maintenance there is to getting that team to work well together. Okay? So generally, we're always advocating for being on the lower end. Okay? We want everybody to be able to have a say. We don't want people slacking. We don't want people sitting idle having nothing to do. So we always generally advocate that a team be on the smaller side. Okay? It involves less maintenance, less administration, so that's why we have less process losses. Okay? It involves greater engagement, right? Because everybody, the accountability is higher for everybody, right? You could not afford to be idle or slack. Okay, the effort will derail. So everybody has a say there. It also saves us some time, okay, because there's less people to coordinate. And another thing that we see is that people have a greater sense of ownership over the project, right? Whereas if it's like 10 people doing one project, again, people are sitting idle, people are not doing that. There's someone who could manage to keep a team together. So generally, people working on a team, when it's of optimal size or on the smaller side, they tend to have greater ownership over the project. Another thing that we need to consider in terms of team composition, and that's all under the design of the team, is the competencies of the people or the members of the team. Okay? And some competencies are more kind of relational. Okay? So things like, showing empathy in how you interact with each other. So that's that comforting competence. Communication, having some competencies pertaining to communication. So are you able to clearly convey requests, and deal with others? So some of them are more kind of relational or on the emotional side, where like, for example, conflict resolving. How do you handle conflict in a team? How do you handle conflict with team members? Okay? And others are more pertaining to like the administration of the work. So you need some competencies pertaining to coordination or cooperation with others. Okay? So those are generally 5 key competencies that we look for when we're assembling a team. So a manager might want to consider whether the people he or she is bringing together to work together have those competencies. Okay? Another element of team composition is the diversity of the team, and we've talked about that quite a bit. Again, key things. Diversity is not just ethnic background or gender, it is way more than that. Okay? Some advantages of diversity is that, diversity, so we're seeing different perspectives. We are challenging each other. So if I have certain biases, you will call me out on my biases. And that will make things better because I am no longer inputting that bias in our project. Okay? So that's something we see. We're able to draw on a variety of backgrounds, right? Like you're an economics major, I'm a marketing major, I'm a this major. We're bringing all of our different backgrounds and forming a very solid base now that we can draw upon. Okay, so that enriches the outcome. Some disadvantages or some things that we need to be wary of when it comes to diversity. The key thing I would say is sometimes it takes time for people who are very different to truly find that level of cohesion or to truly find their commonalities. Sometimes they're actually more daunted by their differences that they lose that motivation. So we're seeing kind of like there's less motivation to coordinate. They get overwhelmed by their differences. But we want to make sure that you give them the right environment and the right norms that help them get there, get over that hurdle. We cannot, completely go blinded into this and say, like, diversity is always great and there's no hurdles with it. No. You will always run into some sort of glitch or hurdle at first. But the key is how do we overcome it? Because diversity could actually pay off quite a bit once we overcome it. Okay? The outcomes might even be way better, but we just need to figure out this glitch. Other things that we see in terms of where are we? Let's just go back to our okay, so we're still under team design. So another element of teams that we also, another element of structures of teams that we also give consideration to is the roles that are assigned to people. And one thing that we need to note is some roles are very formal and assigned, but also there are roles that just emerge sometimes within teams. Like if you consider school projects, right? Usually those are self-directed teams, like the professor doesn't really kind of designate each person to a certain role. But you always find that within certain groups, there's always that one person who always just emerges as a leader of the group, right? So that's kind of an emergent role. It's an informal role. Nobody said that this person is going to be the leader. The professor did not say that this person is going to be the leader. But they just have the attributes that have really enabled them to kind of exert influence over others. Okay? So that's one distinction that we need to consider when it comes to this. Some are formal and designated. Some just emerge. They're informal. Another thing that we see when it comes to roles in teams is this whole process or characteristic of transactive memory. And remember, when we talk about mental models and kind of developing that blueprint, this is something that's similar here. What we're saying is that over time, teams develop that transactive memory when it comes to roles. Okay? And what we're saying here, what we're referring to when it comes to transactive memory is, over time, people kind of just start automatically associating certain people with certain roles and having certain knowledge, right? So I know automatically who to go to for this aspect of the project because I know that you're a subject matter expert on it. Experience has shown me, okay? So that's when we say a team has kind of transactive memory, okay? And that it has a certain blueprint that's already been established, and that facilitates things for it, okay? And that's what we call transactive memory when it comes to roles. That everybody is aware of what contribution they make. Everybody is aware of what pieces of knowledge everybody contributes. Okay, so I'm kicking into that automatically. That's why it's called transactive memory. Other things that we see develop in teams, and now we've shifted into the team states component of the model. Okay, so one key thing that we see is norms. So teams, to be effective, have to develop norms, and as we already mentioned, those are things like traditions, rituals, consequences, ways of doing things, patterns that work for the collective. Okay? Some things that generate norms, or some things that contribute to the development of norms. Usually sometimes initial experiences, so when you're bonding as a team, right? You may come to agreement on this. You might say, this is what we deem to be appropriate, so those are our norms. Sometimes if you go through conflict with each other, you learn from it. And you say, okay, we're going to move forward by implementing this, or by agreeing on those rituals and traditions. Okay, so sometimes past conflict could generate those norms. Essentially, we're saying that you learn from it. Sometimes different people bring in their own experiences and say, I've seen that work in another group, I think we should implement it in this group. So that is one way that it could work. Okay. Some best practices when it comes to developing good norms, functional norms. Okay. You want to make sure that they're very clearly communicated. You want to make sure that everybody has a say in developing those norms or setting them. You want to make sure that anything that can be counterproductive, you have some guidelines surrounding how you're going to deal with that. So consequences, again, accountability, we're seeing that emerge again and again. You want to be very wary of kind of shift disturbers in a sense. Some people who may kind of not be helping the team abide by those norms. Okay, so just some general guidelines for that.
Jumping back to transactive memory.
Yeah.
How it makes it seem that like you can only really have it when a team's already kind of formed and you're going back on a new project or whatever, right? How do you motivate newly forming teams? Are there any kind of
How do you help them kick into that transactive memory early on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's where you might kind of want to make sure that there's a lot of communication when it comes to introductions, when it comes to team building activities. Yeah. You're helping them gain as much exposure as possible to each other, I would say. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of those early introductory processes. I would say that's where you could help kick into that transactive memory much earlier.
So implement assigning specific challenges or something like that.
You could, yeah. I mean, as team building activities, for example, we generally are focused on that. And we've put a group of people through certain challenges to kind of highlight their strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, so you could make that argument, I'd say, for sure. Yeah. Another team state that really gets a lot of attention and we study quite a bit is team cohesion. And cohesion, by definition, it's really tapping into kind of how attractive it is to work on a certain team, right? So how much am I really craving to be on that team? When we see a team of people really wanting to work with each other and really craving being with each other, and they show that high level of bonding, right? That's when we say that a team is cohesive, right? It's so exclusive in a sense, right? They work so well with each other that it's not very easy to kind of just be let onto their team or to just kind of be let into their project, right? So for example, let's compare two consulting companies, McKinsey or BCG versus Deloitte, okay? It's much easier to get into Deloitte for a job. Whereas if you want to get into McKinsey or you want to get into BCG, oh boy, they're going to put you through so many hurdles and things until you can get there, right? Because They are more specialized. They are very similar. They hire a certain prototype of consultant. Whereas Deloitte is much more general in their business model. They take in people from all walks of life and all schools and all backgrounds. Whereas McKinsey and BCG, you find they have a certain level of exclusivity. They only take certain people from certain schools with certain backgrounds. Okay? And that's kind of their way of maintaining their cohesiveness as an organization. And that this is what we stand for, and this is our common identity, and we're not having anything jeopardize that, including how we form teams and consultants. Okay? So that is one way you could see that cohesiveness and why we define it in the sense of attractiveness or exclusivity.
When we talk about the cohesion, is it just the want to be in a certain type of team members, or is it that they're effective at working together?
It's that this team is so great that the people in it never want to leave it, and they love working with each other, and people outside it are dying to get into it, right? And that's where you find that element of like, wow, this team is so good. They are so good together, right? That's kind of a keyword. They're so good together, and that's why it's called cohesion, right? There's that level of kind of bonding between them that they never want to jeopardize that, but also others are dying to get into that.
What factors the job they do, like satisfaction they get from the job they do as a team, like
Because they're cohesive versus not.
no, I'm saying like once the team is good, then they feel that they're a good team, or they feel that they're a good like a group of people.
So you're saying if it's a team of, if it's a group of people who are individually good
Yeah,
versus
they feel that
they're good as a team,
yeah.
that's the thing where it's kind of, yes, you're all great as people theoretically, right? Like everybody in this class is great theoretically. If I take you as a if I silo you and look at you as an individual, you're great. But we do require teamwork at the end of the day, and it's not all additive, right? So just because you're great and Lavina is great, it doesn't mean when I get you guys working in a group together that your effort as a team is going to be great, because you may have lots of things that will clash. Okay, so I would say if teamwork is really what you're interested in, you want to make sure that the team, all these elements of the team, the characteristics of the team are great, not just individual characteristics. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if there is any conflict between team cohesion and team diversity.
Okay, well, what would you assume? Like if there's more diversity?
So then there would be less team cohesion?
Yeah, especially at first. It doesn't, like, generally, yes, there is less cohesion, but it doesn't mean that we can't overcome that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So, yes, I would say, simply speaking, probably a negative correlation, but you could overcome that.
Okay,
Okay?
thank you.
I was just going to ask, is there a negative part of having team cohesion sometimes? Because you mentioned that
We
people are dying to get
covering
in.
that. Yes.
You are. Okay.
Yes, I think it's in the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Let's just cover kind of like what helps team cohesion, and then
Yeah.
we'll go to the disadvantages.
Cool.
So some things to consider that build cohesion or that facilitate greater cohesion. Smaller teams, okay? So they're more able to bond faster, okay? More homogeneity, okay? So that's your
Mm-hmm.
okay? When there's regular communication or interaction between the people, again, we're seeing that element of exclusivity or entering that team is really hard, right? So once you've actually been hired by McKinsey, you're going to make sure you're really bonding well with these people because you don't want to jeopardize a job with McKinsey, right? You want to be in that exclusive firm. You want to be in that exclusive team, okay? If a team succeeds or if a team is known to be stellar, that just propels them to or compels them to bond even more, right? Because they're so great that they don't want to jeopardize that, so they become even more cohesive. Also, if they're getting competition from the outside, that also gets them to kind of bond together and work in a more cohesive manner. Okay? In terms of cohesion and performance, generally it's a positive relationship, so cohesion generates greater levels of performance because we see a lot of information sharing going on. We see greater motivation by the people who are on that team to work, right? They're interested in working on that team. There's a greater level of satisfaction with the team, which could generate greater job satisfaction. There's more support within among the team members, and they tend to figure out ways to resolve conflict in a much faster manner. Okay, they don't let it kind of just linger around. Some things within the environment that could generate a greater level of cohesion or be more conducive for cohesion or call for more cohesion. If again we're seeing if the task features a greater level of interdependence. Okay, so again we all need each other. We cannot just rely on working individually on this. We need each other. So cohesion is definitely a must here. Okay? And we're also seeing kind of norms come into play here. Okay? So for a team to generate a great level of cohesion, we want the norms to be similar. We want some level of homogeneity. Okay? So that doesn't mean that diversity has to completely take a hit on this. It's just we need to figure out what works for that diverse group of people and establish those norms so that they can be cohesive. Okay, so those are some things to keep in mind. Oh, sorry, no, I thought we were covering disadvantages, but I guess we're not. In terms of team, so your question was in terms of when there's like that exclusivity.
Yeah, and like because you said people were dying to be part of that.
Yeah.
Group.
So some other keywords that we've already seen in the lecture, overconfidence, I would say sometimes. Again, you're great as a team, you work great together, but don't let that get in your way. Okay? Don't let that stifle your innovation, for example. Okay? Or not being willing to listen to the third-party perspective on things. Okay? So you just want to make sure that you remain receptive and open to other information or outside sources. And also you don't want to be too overconfident to the extent where you don't even realize weaknesses that are coming.
Would they still be considered cohesive
If
they were, I guess.
yes, technically, yeah, they are cohesive. It's just their cohesion has gotten to a point where it's making them stale.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, cohesion could make you stale.
Okay.
Okay, if you're not willing to remain open to the outside world. Another state that we see within teams is the state of trust. Okay, so how much trust is there between the team members? And we have different levels of trust that emerge within teams. The lowest level being kind of that very transactional level of trust. We call it calculus-based trust. And that's kind of basically, you go into a project, like let's say a group project in a class. You know that if you guys don't do the work, you're not going to get the grade. So you have that kind of transactional level of trust in others, and that, or if there's a peer review or a peer evaluation score, right? Everybody, you go into that team expecting, with some level of trust. It's not the greatest level of trust, but it's a very transactional level of trust because there are consequences. If you don't work on the project, if you don't deliver effort, you're going to deal with some negative consequences in terms of grade. So it's just a very transactional level of trust, and we call it calculus-based trust. The one in the middle is knowledge-based trust, and that's kind of like based on your experience or based on your role or based on previous work that I've seen you do in the past. I know that you could deliver something good, something decent. Okay? So I don't know you very well, I just know your work, I know your body of work, I know your role and what that involves. So I think you're going to be good. Okay? And that highest level of trust is where we truly share an identity. We really believe in each other, and we really think of each other we think of ourselves as a collective. We don't even think of ourselves as an individual anymore. We're at that high level, like it's that great. We have that high level of trust that we share an identity. Okay, that's why that one is called identification-based trust. In terms of team processes, and that's where we're kind of concerned with the different activities that go on. And activities could be broken down into two. It could be activities pertaining to the task itself, okay? So task work behavior, okay? So the coordination of work, the communication of roles in the team, who's in charge of what, who's following up with whom. So you have those types of processes going on. Those fall under task work. And then you have teamwork behaviors, okay? So those are more things about, how do you maintain the peace? How do you maintain a regular flow of work? But with a focus on kind of the emotional aspects and the behavioral aspects. This is the social aspects of the team. Okay? So you see those things going on internally. Okay? And then you have processes between the team itself and how it relates to other entities. Okay? So, as a marketing team, are you collaborating with finance in the organization? Are you collaborating with HR in the organization? Okay, so what processes and mechanisms link you to these outside sources? Okay, so we see processes in two types there. That's it for this. I included an appendix with some very trivial stuff that was in the book. So they just talked about some concepts like, for example, team building, self-directed teams, and virtual teams. I just put them as like nice to know, but you probably already know them. So just kind of scan them very quickly, but that's it. Questions?
Yeah, for the identification-based trust.
Yes.
Yeah, in this case, is it gonna build by time or it is?
I would say time. It takes, right? Like you don't just share an identity with someone just by maybe reading their resume more carefully, right? It's something where it's like you've worked with each other on several projects, you've interacted with each other socially, outside projects. It takes time, I would say it's a matter of time.
But I mean, for the team cohesion, let's say I want to start with a McKinsey, so should I share that level of trust with them because I know the background of those team and I know.
Even for a cohesive team or organization, I would say let's say yes, they just put you on a team at McKinsey, you just started new. They probably, I would say, have knowledge-based trust. Okay, but because they know that you were hired according to the same criteria, and they know that it takes. There are some stringent criteria that they're vetting you for McKinsey. So I'd say there's a greater likelihood that you might start in the middle. But you can't say that, for example, a certain higher partner in the firm is going to give you that level of trust early on, right? They might be on a calculus-based level of trust with you, right? They say, okay, we hired him, he passed the interview, but still, I'm not giving him the benefit of the doubt yet. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, variations. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and come back and do the communication chapter. There's a break.